The year was 1922, and the city of New York was breathing a heavy gray mist that rolled off the Hudson River and tangled itself between the brick towers of Manhattan. It was a time of transition, where horse-drawn wagons still shared the cobblestones with rumbling automobiles, and the silence of the evenings was broken only by the distant cry of a newsboy or the rhythmic clatter of the elevated trains. In a narrow 6-story walk-up on the corner of Greenwich Avenue, the building hummed with the quiet, separate lives of its tenants. This is where Elias first saw her. Elias was a man of routine, a ledger-keeper for a shipping firm down by the docks. He was 34, with hair that was already thinning and hands that were permanently stained with ink. He kept his head down, his collar starched, and his thoughts private. He lived on the 4th floor, in a room that was barely large enough for a bed and a dresser. The woman, whose name he would later learn was Clara, lived on the 2nd floor, in a room across the hall from the landlady. Their first meeting was not a meeting at all, but a collision of schedules. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn. The gaslights in the hallway flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Elias was trudging up the stairs, exhausted from a day of columns and numbers. Clara was coming down, carrying a basket of laundry that smelled faintly of lye soap and rain. The staircase was narrow, barely wide enough for two. They stopped on the 3rd-floor landing. Elias moved to the side, pressing his back against the cool wall to let her pass. She looked up, and for a second, the sounds of the city, the car horns, the shouting, the trains seemed to vanish. She was not young, perhaps in her late 20s, with a face that was plain but kind, framed by a dark wool hat pulled low against the chill. Her eyes were tired, the kind of tired that comes from long hours of work, but they held a softness that caught him off guard. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement of her head. Elias tipped his own hat, his fingers brushing the brim. "Good evening," he whispered. His voice sounded rough, unused to speaking in the quiet of the hallway. "Good evening," she replied. Her voice was low, melody hidden in the shadows. She continued down the stairs, the hem of her coat brushing the steps with a soft swish. Elias watched her until she turned the corner out of sight, then continued his climb, feeling a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. From that night on, their lives settled into a silent rhythm. They were strangers who shared a staircase, yet they became the most constant part of each other's days. In the mornings, the building would wake up. The sound of alarm clocks ringing through thin walls, the slam of doors, the rush of feet on the stairs. Elias would leave at 7:30. Clara would leave at 7:55. He would see her from his window sometimes, walking down the street toward the subway station, her head bent against the wind. She walked with purpose, carrying a small lunch pail. He often timed his own departure so he would be a few paces behind her, close enough to see the blue of her coat, but far enough away to remain unseen. It was a distance he maintained out of respect, and perhaps out of a fear of breaking the fragile peace of their anonymity. Their encounters in the building were brief. Sometimes, if the laundry was drying on the lines in the shared courtyard, Elias would see her hanging sheets, her red chapped hands moving deftly in the cold air. He would stand on the fire escape, smoking a cigarette, and watch the steam rise from her coffee cup on the windowsill. They never waved, they never called out. There was a solemn understanding between them, a recognition of the shared struggle of life in the big city. They were two small ships passing in a vast, dark harbor, signaling their presence only through the blink of an eye or the tilt of a hat. Winter turned to spring, and the city shifted. The snow melted, revealing the grime of the streets, and the air filled with the smell of asphalt and horse manure. One evening in May, a heavy rainstorm trapped the residents of the building indoors. The power flickered and died, leaving the hallway in pitch blackness. Elias was coming home late, the collar of his coat turned up against the downpour. He fumbled for the doorknob, but the door was already being held open. It was Clara. She was holding a candle, the flame trembling in the draught from the open door. The light cast a warm glow on her face, softening the lines of worry around her mouth. "The lights are out," she said, stating the obvious but filling the silence. "So I see," Elias said, stepping into the dry warmth of the hallway. He shook the water from his umbrella. "Thank you for holding the door." She smiled, just a curving of the lips, but it reached her eyes. "It's a bad night to be locked out." They stood there for a moment, the candlelight illuminating the space between them. He could smell the faint scent of lavender coming from her clothes. He wanted to say something more. He wanted to ask about her day, or if she was warm enough, or if she ever felt as lonely as he did in a city of millions. but the social rules of the time were as rigid as the iron railings beside them. One did not impose. One did not pry. "Do you have enough candles?" Elias asked, his voice tight. "I have a few," she answered. "Be careful on the stairs. The third step from the top is loose." "I know," he said. "I know." She nodded and turned to walk down to her room, the candlelight creating a halo around her as she descended. Elias watched until the light disappeared around the bend. He climbed the stairs in the dark, counting them by heart. The image of her face in the candlelight burned into his mind. As the years passed, the world around them began to change at a terrifying speed. The roaring 20s brought a frantic energy to the streets. Jazz music spilled out of speakeasies, skirts got shorter, and the noise level grew. But inside their building, time seemed to move slower. They grew older, their hair graying at the temples, their steps a little heavier. Elias was promoted, then laid off during a minor downturn, then hired by a different firm. He stopped wearing his hat quite so often. Clara stopped taking the subway. She now worked at a bakery just around the corner. They never spoke of their feelings. It was a love that existed entirely in the space between breaths. It was in the way she would pause on the landing if she heard his door open, waiting for the sound of his tread. It was in the way he would polish the brass handle of the front door every Sunday, knowing it was her hand that would touch it first thing in the morning. Then came the crash of 1929. The city did not fall silent, it screamed. The sound of shouting on Wall Street carried for miles, and the lines of men waiting for bread snaked around city blocks. The atmosphere in the building changed. Families moved out, their furniture piled high on trucks, their faces pale with defeat. The rent went down, then the vacancies went up. The landlord stopped repairing the steps. The brass handle turned dull. Elias felt the pressure like a vice. His job was safe, for now, but his wages were cut. He stopped buying tobacco. He wore his overcoat until the wool was shiny with age. He saw Clara less often. She seemed to be always working, her hands rougher, her face thinner. When they passed on the stairs now, they did not stop. There was no time for the luxury of a lingering glance. There was only the rush to survive, the desperate scramble to keep a roof over one's head. The turning point came on a cold Tuesday in November 1931. Elias came home to find a notice posted on the lobby door. The building was being sold. The rent was doubling. Most of the remaining tenants had until the end of the month to leave. His heart sank. He walked up the stairs, his legs feeling like lead. He knew he could not afford the new rent. He knew he would have to move to a boarding house in Brooklyn or the Bronx, somewhere far from this street, this building, and her. When he reached the second-floor landing, he saw Clara. She was standing outside her door, holding a small suitcase. A stack of wooden crates sat next to her. She was looking at the doorframe, her hand resting on the wood, as if saying goodbye to the room itself. He stopped. The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything they had never said. The sound of the city outside seemed very far away. "You are leaving," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Clara turned to look at him. Her eyes were red, but her expression was composed. "I have no choice, Elias. My sister has a place in Jersey City. I can stay with her until things get better." He nodded, his throat tight. "I am leaving too," he said. "I go to Queens on Saturday." They stood there, the dim light of the hallway fading into evening. This was the moment the novels always wrote about, the dramatic confession, the kiss in the rain, the promise to wait. But this was not a novel. This was real life, in a city crushed by history. They had no money. They had no security. To make a promise they couldn't keep would be a cruelty. Clara looked down at her gloves, pulling at a loose thread. "I will miss the stairs," she said softly. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, taking in every detail of her face for the last time. He wanted to tell her that she was the only light in his grey life. He wanted to tell her that he loved her patience, her quiet strength, the way she hummed when she hung the laundry. Instead, he said, "The third step is still loose. Be careful going down." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I remember," she said. She picked up her suitcase. Elias moved to the side, pressing his back against the wall, just as he had done nearly 10 years ago. It was the same dance, performed for the final time. She walked past him, her coat brushing his arm. At the top of the next flight of stairs, she paused. She did not look back. She just raised one hand, a simple gesture of farewell. "Goodbye, Elias," she whispered. "Goodbye, Clara," he whispered to the empty air after she was gone. He listened to her footsteps descend, counting them. 1, 2, 3. The creak of the loose board. then silence as she opened the front door and walked out into the street. He stood there for a long time, looking down the empty stairwell. The building felt like a shell, hollow and cold. Elias moved to Queens the following Saturday. He lived a long life. He married, years later, to a kind woman who worked in a laundry. They had a comfortable, quiet companionship. He never saw Clara again. He never found out if she returned to the city or if she found the happiness she deserved. But the world kept shifting. The Great Depression ended, and a war began, and the city grew taller and louder, transforming itself again and again. The old brownstone on Greenwich Avenue was eventually torn down to make way for a modern apartment block. The loose step, the peeling wallpaper, and the brass handle were all turned to dust. Yet, in the quiet moments of his old age, when the rain tapped against his window pane, Elias would sometimes close his eyes and see the flicker of a gaslight. He would feel the brush of a wool coat and smell the scent of lavender. He would remember the way the world could stop, just for a second, on a narrow staircase, and how two people could share a love so deep it didn't need a single word to sustain it. History had moved on, sweeping them away in its current, but that small, timeless space remained, hidden like a secret in the ruins of time.